Crimson Tide. The first time I met Dr. James Chen, I was underwater in 50 feet of black water, excavating the skeletal remains of a 1743 Spanish galleon when he surfaced next to me and made an emergency get to shore now gesture that would have been funny if it hadn't terrified me half to death. I didn't know who he was. Just some guy in scuba gear with intensity radiating off him like a physical force, pointing urgently toward the surface while his eyes, even behind the mask, communicated apocalyptic urgency. We shot up together, and by the time we broke the surface, I could already hear the wind shift. That particular sound you recognize immediately if you've lived on the Gulf Coast your whole life, the barometric pressure dropping like a stone. Hurricanes turning, he said, ripping out his regulator. National Weather Service just updated. Category 4 now tracking direct hit. We need the artifact salvage op shut down. Now, I was Marcus Webb, 32, marine archaeologist for the University of South Alabama's Coastal Heritage Program. I'd spent 8 years learning to read the ocean, learning to dive, learning to document shipwrecks with the precision of a forensic scientist. And this guy, tall, maybe 28, with black hair plastered to his skull and a Polish-American accent cutting through the Alabamian heat, was telling me to abandon my dive site. I've got 48 hours before the weather window closes, I said, already swimming toward the research vessel. The artifact documentation will be underwater for another 280 years if we don't get inland, he interrupted, matching my pace stroke for stroke. I'm Dr. James Kowalski, historic shipyard restoration specialist for the state of Alabama, and I'm telling you, we stop, we secure, we evacuate. That's the order. The order doesn't account for scientific preservation, it accounts for your survival. He hauled himself onto the boat with the kind of strength that made me pause mid-thought. Look at me. I restore colonial-era ships. I know what water does to 280-year-old wood. You know what else does? Category 4 hurricanes. Your artifact survives the storm. You might not. Our captain, an ancient Cajun named Boudreaux, was already killing the engines. Kowalski's right, Webb. I can feel it coming. We got maybe 6 hours to get back to port and secure the site. I looked at this guy, this James Kowalski who'd surfaced next to me like some underwater guardian angel, and felt something shift. Not just the pressure system, something in my chest. Fine, I said. We secure and evacuate. But tomorrow before landfall, I'm going back down. No, you're not, James said calmly. Tomorrow you're going to be helping me salvage the historical records from the Mobile Maritime Heritage Center before the surge hits. I'm not a preservation specialist. You're an archaeologist. You understand artifact value and handling. You're also currently my only resource because everyone else either evacuated or is working storm surge barriers. He was already heading below deck. Welcome to Emergency Historical Preservation, Dr. Webb. The Heritage Center occupied a pre-Civil War mansion 3 blocks from the water. I'd never been inside. My work was usually in the field, cataloging what the ocean had already taken. But James moved through those halls like he'd mapped every inch, pointing to boxes of documents, maritime ledgers from the 1700s, hand-drawn ship plans that predated photography. These go, he said, gesturing to carefully wrapped artifacts. These stay, they're duplicates. These, he paused at a climate-controlled case containing what looked like a ship's navigation log from the 1740s. These are irreplaceable. We worked through the night, packing carefully, loading his truck, a battered Ford that somehow had more salvaged maritime equipment than I had clothes. James moved with methodical precision, but I caught him pausing sometimes, touching the artifacts like they were sacred things. Why do you care this much? I asked around 0300, wrapping a set of brass maritime instruments. Most restoration specialists, they're practical, efficient, I struggled for the word, reverent, because these things survived. He was wrapping navigation charts with the care of someone handling newborns. A ship sank in 1743. Everything that could rot did. Everything that should have been lost to the ocean, somehow, these survived. They made it through storms, through centuries, through people who didn't know how to preserve them, through neglect and ignorance. And now they're in our hands. That's not just a job, that's a responsibility. I watched him work, Dark eyes focused, hands sure, this man who'd emerged from the ocean like some maritime superhero to tell me to evacuate. And I felt something click into place. Recognition. The kind you get when you meet someone who speaks your dialect of caring about impossible things. I get it, I said quietly. The artifact survives. We make sure it does. He looked up and smiled. Yeah, we do. The wind started around 0500. Real wind, the kind that makes the buildings creak and the windows rattle. We were on the last load, final boxes of records, when James's phone lit up with a National Weather Service alert. Category 4, he read. Landfall 1800 hours. Storm surge 18 to 22 feet. Wind 140 mile per hour sustained. We're not done, I said, looking at the boxes still stacked in the climate vault. We're leaving. James was already heading toward the stairs. Now, the surge is going to hit the harbor in 13 hours. This building's 3 blocks inland. It won't matter. High tide plus storm surge. The water comes ashore like a tsunami. The remaining artifacts are worth nothing if you're dead. He grabbed my arm and I let him, because his eyes were terrified and determined and absolutely serious. We get inland. We get to higher ground. We do everything we can, Marcus, but we don't die for artifacts, even if they're 280 years old. I wanted to argue, wanted to stay and keep working, but I recognized that look. I'd seen it in my own mirror. That specific expression of someone choosing survival over obsession. Just barely. Okay, I said, we evacuate. James had a house 40 miles inland near Selma. Elevated, on high ground, old enough to have survived previous hurricanes, but well maintained enough that you knew he cared about it. We arrived with the sky turning that specific shade of green that means atmospheric upheaval. Make yourself comfortable, he said, which was funny because we both knew this hurricane was going to be anything but comfortable. I need to check the backup generator, secure the shutters, and he paused, looking at me. I need to do something else first. He led me to his kitchen, where he pulled out 2 bottles of local craft beer and a bag of boiled peanuts. Sit, he commanded. I sat. We've been working for 17 hours straight, he said, opening both beers. We're both running on adrenaline and preservation instinct, but in about 4 hours this storm is going to hit. And we're not going anywhere for 36 hours after that. So we're going to sit here, eat terrible peanuts, drink beer, and I'm going to tell you why I became a restoration specialist so you don't think I'm completely insane. I laughed despite everything. Okay, I'll bite. Why? Because my family came from Poland in 1952 with nothing. My grandfather was a carpenter. Not fancy, he built houses, rebuilt damaged structures, worked construction. He taught me that preservation matters. That things old people make, things that survive, they have stories, and if you don't maintain them, those stories die. He cracked open a peanut. I was 8 years old when he died. He was restoring an 1890s Victorian house in Milwaukee, fell off scaffolding, and I remember being at his funeral thinking he spent his whole life saving things and nothing saved him. The vulnerability in that admission made my chest ache. So I became an archaeologist, I offered, to find what people left behind to prove they mattered. Did it work? Some days. I met his eyes. Today, for the first time, I'm thinking maybe it matters more when someone's doing it with you. The storm hit at 1847 hours. The wind wasn't like the blizzard in videos. It was worse. It was personal, violent, the sound of atmospheric fury making the house shake. The power went out at 1922. James calmly activated the generator, tested the backup lights, and then, because apparently he was a person who lived prepared, started making coffee on a camp stove. You grew up in this, he said, handing me a mug. Hurricane season Gulf Coast. Mobile's weathered worse, I said, but my hands were shaking slightly, and James noticed. Yeah, but you've never weathered one with someone trying to save you before, have you? He sat next to me on the couch, close enough that I could feel his presence, the solidity of him. That changes the equation. Suddenly you're not just scared for yourself. Are you, I asked. Scared? Terrified, he admitted. But not of the hurricane. Of this. He gestured between us. Of the fact that I met you less than 24 hours ago, and I'm already thinking about what happens when the power comes back on, and we have to figure out if this was just storm adrenaline, or if it's real, I finished. Yeah. The wind screamed outside. The house held. When's the last time you did something for yourself, I asked. Not the artifacts, not the preservation work. For you. I honestly can't remember. He was staring into his coffee. There's always another building to restore, another artifact to save. I came to Alabama because the Coastal Heritage Program needed expertise. I was going to stay 6 months. That was 2 years ago. Why did you stay? Because they needed me. He paused. But also because staying felt safer than leaving. If I'm always working, I don't have to think about being alone. I reached over, took his hand. It was warm and slightly calloused and absolutely solid. You're not alone, I said. Not right now. He turned to look at me, and in the emergency lighting, that weird combination of battery-powered lamps and occasional lightning, I could see everything. The exhaustion, the intensity, the longing, the recognition that this was happening whether we'd planned for it or not. Are you seeing anyone? He asked. Before I do something I can't take back. No, I said, are you? No. He kissed me like we were salvaging something precious, like I was an artifact that mattered. His hand came up to my face, careful, reverent, the same touch he used with 280-year-old navigation charts. When he pulled back, we were both breathing hard. This is insane, he whispered. Absolutely insane, I agreed. We met yesterday. I know, but I kissed him again, and he stopped arguing. We spent the next 34 hours doing what people do when trapped in a house during a hurricane. We talked, we slept in shifts, one of us always monitoring the generator, the backup systems. We made love with the kind of urgency and tenderness that only happens when you've survived something together. Around hour 30, the wind started to ease. The worst had passed. James checked the news on his battery-powered radio. Category 4 had weakened to 3. Storm surge had hit, but not catastrophically. Mobile's infrastructure had held. The Heritage Center, I asked, will need assessment, but the building survived worse. He was holding me, his chin resting on my shoulder. We saved what we could. The rest is in God's hands now. And ours, I said, tomorrow, when we can go back. Tomorrow, he agreed. When the power came back on at hour 34, we were sitting on his porch watching the sky clear. The air smelled like salt and destruction and new beginnings. His hand was in mine. So, James said, when the hurricane ends, when things go back to normal, when we have to figure out what this actually is instead of what it had to be, what happens then? Then, I said slowly, I think we keep salvaging, but instead of artifacts, we salvage this being, whatever we are when the adrenaline stops, whatever we become when we're not in crisis. I turned to face him. I'm thinking that's worth the effort. He smiled. This man who'd pulled me from the ocean, who'd saved historical records, who'd cared enough to make sure I didn't die for a shipwreck. Yeah, he said, I'm thinking that's worth the effort too. Epilogue. 3 months later, the Heritage Center reopened with a permanent exhibit, Storm Survival, the artifacts that endured. James had curated it. I'd helped document every piece, every story, every reason why these objects mattered enough to risk lives for. The opening ceremony was a small affair, just museum staff, a few state officials, and James standing next to me with his hand on the small of my back, introducing me to everyone like I was the most important thing in the room. This is Dr. Marcus Webb, he said to the state director. Marine archaeologist, artifact preservation specialist, and the most stubborn person I've ever met. You're one to talk, I murmured. We make a good team, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Later, standing in front of the 1743 navigation log, the one he'd handled with reverence during evacuation, James pulled me to the side. I have a question, he said. Okay, are you seeing anyone? He asked, and I laughed because it was our joke now, the question that had started everything. No, I said, are you? I'm thinking of asking someone, he said seriously. Someone I met during a hurricane. Someone who understands that preservation matters. Someone who came out of the ocean like he was meant to be there. Sounds like a good person, I said. He is. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. So I'm asking, Dr. Marcus Webb, will you keep salvaging this with me? Forever? Inside was a ring. Not fancy, just elegant. Something that looked like it belonged in both a museum and on someone's hand. Yes, I said, and kissed him in front of 280 years of history. The artifacts survived. We survived. And that, as James always said, was worth the effort.